Welcome to Chapter 12 of Intro to Psychology. In this video, we'll be talking about prejudice and discrimination, particularly as it applies to the study of racism and psychology. So before we describe what racism is and how it's been studied scientifically and the many different definitions of racism, it's important for us to define race. When we say race, we're talking about a grouping of humans that is based on shared physical or social qualities into categories that are generally viewed as distinct by society. So we're talking about physical, social qualities of individuals that are categorized by society. And race is a relatively new concept in the history of the world. There's a tendency to think that things have always been the way they have been, that we've always characterized people into various races. And that's not always true. Many of the terms that we use to describe people of different cultures or of different places around the world or of different physical or social qualities have evolved over time. And many of these terms are confusing and overlap somewhat. And so it's important to have good definitions, working definitions of what these things mean. These are some of the accepted definitions in the field of psychology, also some terms borrowed from sociology. So when we say race, we're referring to terms like white, Black, Asian. Then there are other races that other people can come up with that some would say are definitions of race, and others would say might more reflect ethnicity. So you may see on the U.S. Census, for example, you might be asked to mark your race and then mark your ethnicity, or and ethnicity may be limited to two options: Hispanic or not. And that is because someone's status as being Hispanic or not is generally regarded as an ethnicity, not a race. That people who are Hispanic can be white. People who are Hispanic can be Black. Their race could be distinct from their ethnicity. And when we say ethnicity, we are talking about a category of people who identify with each other based on similarities such as common ancestry, language, histories, society, culture, or nation. So ethnicity is really the broadest and probably most accurate term to describe a group of people. And I should say more accurate because of the limitations associated with the historical and multiple definitions of the word race, whereas ethnicity is something that's a little bit more malleable to encompass different cultures. So for example, when we say Hispanic or Latino, we are referring to an ethnicity, right? So people from Brazil who are Black, we might say in terms of their race, they're Black, but they might identify as Latino. Latino being individuals of a shared kind of cultural and linguistic, or no, I should say, just cultural or nationalities within North, Central, and South America, as well as the Caribbean. When we say the word Latino, we are speaking about individuals from the Americas. It does not include individuals who trace their ethnicity to Spain. So it's not talking about Europeans. Whereas when we say Hispanic, that is tapping into a more less geographic or less, I should say, culturally based definition of an ethnicity, and rather a more linguistic based definition of ethnicity. These are Spanish speaking countries. So that includes Spain and leaves out obviously Portugal, where they speak Portuguese, and also Brazil, where Portuguese is the predominant language. So the words Hispanic and Latino often used interchangeably, but mean different things and allow us to describe different things about a person's ethnicity. Also, ethnicities might be more broadly described. People who can trace their ancestry to a particular region of the world. So we might say that a person is Asian American, to say that they are from America, but also trace their ancestry to an Asian country. Within that, there could be many, many different subdivisions. We could say, a person could say that they are South Asian to refer to places like India and Sri Lanka, or go even further into that and say that they are a Punjab, or that they are referring to a specific ethnic group within a culture or a country, such as India. And once again, there's a tendency for Americans and for Western individuals to view these other nations as monoliths, as just all people who are all the same, and yet we view our own country as very, very diverse and very, very rich. Uh, what's much more closer to the truth is that many of these other places around the world have very broad linguistic groups, very broad ethnic cultures and values, and are much more different and much more varied than we often assume. Likewise, we might say for some individuals, the term African American refers to individuals who are American and do not trace their ancestry to any other nation besides America, but are of African descent. So, in other words, descendants of enslaved people brought to this country. Whereas the term Black would refer to individuals of the race more broadly. So people who can trace their ancestry to an African nation, or to a Caribbean nation, or who identifies Black otherwise in another part of the world. So there's a discrepancy between race and ethnicity can be on just on a very surface level. It can also go multiple levels deep. Another example could be individuals who are West African versus East African. There are certain physical features that we might associate, or certain linguistic cultures, or values, or linguistic properties we might associate with those different cultures. And within those West African or East African nations, many, many more subdivisions. And then lastly, the concepts of nationality as well as citizenship, which is the status of belonging to a particular nation. So someone could say that their race is white. They could say that their nationality is Scottish, and that those are not referring to the same thing. Oftentimes, the term American is used to mean white. And that's a misappropriation of the word. American is a declaration of nationality or citizenship, or we might use the word Indian and use that to refer to someone's ethnicity, or sometimes misuse it to describe someone's race. And more accurately, that could be used to describe someone's nationality, as we've previously described. Many of these nations that we lump together as being a monolith have many different ethnic groups, or even racial groups represented within that singular nationality. Furthermore, when we talk about race, there's many movements to describe how race is not a valid biological construct. Race is often viewed as a separate and special characteristic of people, often based on skin color and other physical properties. But it's not a valid biological construct. From a biological perspective, what we see as race is really just the rules of genetics and heredity at work. So for example, if you look at this slide, all of these individuals identify as Black. So the woman in the top left-hand corner is someone that you probably would easily recognize as Black, whereas the individual to her right, probably less so. Why? Simply based on skin color, or the individual in the bottom right, who has a mixed skin complexion, or any of these other individuals who don't look stereotypically Black, but can yet still identify as a member of that race. What it brings up is that race is really a sociological construct, that it's not something that is simply defined by any one biological feature. It's not solely defined by skin color, because you can find people who do not fit that description who belong to that race. It's not solely defined by the size of a person's any other aspect of their facial features, or any other linguistic or any other cultural variables. There are always exceptions to the rules when it comes to race. You have other situations like these individuals shown here, individuals who have the same parents. These are some examples of twins. who are born with different skin colors. And from the outside looking in, you might say that, oh, one twin is white and one twin is black. And what you realize is that these individuals share much of the same DNA with very little variation. And so their entity is not defined, their biological entities are not defined by what race they belong to, but instead it's just defined by who their parents were. Many of these individuals have parents who are of mixed race, and so the expression of their genes in terms of their physical features come up with different skin colors or different hair textures. And so belonging to a particular race does not mean that you belong to a specific genetic category. Rather, it just means that you belong to a different societal construct or a different societal group that we ascribe to you, not because of your biological makeup, but because of the values of society. And so, although race is not a valid biological construct, that doesn't mean that racism is not real. Race is a valid sociological construct, and it still has real effects that can be measured today. And so when we come to the definition of racism, there's many, many different definitions, many debates on which terms or which ways of defining this concept should be used and be taught. And so I'll present many different ideas and ways of thinking about racism. One is to think of it as prejudice and discrimination against an individual based solely on one's membership in a specific racial group. That's probably the basic definition. That's the definition provided by the textbook that acts, or I should say feelings of prejudice or acts of discrimination against an individual based on their membership in a racial group, based on being Black, based on being white, based on being Asian, so on and so forth. This definition ignores the societal or the systemic or the other ways in which racism can play out. So other definitions of race would say that it is prejudice and power. It's not just prejudice and discrimination committed against individuals, but prejudice and discrimination combined with a power differential, combined with systems of governance or systems of access, particularly when we talk about socioeconomic status, financial systems of access, or educational systems of access that are based on race. Another writer has said that racism is a system of advantage based on race, that not only do individuals who experience racism, not only do they experience discrimination and prejudice, but they are systemically kept from certain advantages in society based on historical power differences between individuals of certain racial groups. Perhaps the core notion or the core, if we're only examining racism from a cognitive perspective, the core belief in racism is that race is a primary determinant of human traits and capacities, that you belonging to a specific racial group, you being Black, you being white, you being Asian, is the primary determinant of who you are as a person, and that differences between racial groups produce an inherent superiority for particular races. That some races are inherently superior. By virtue of you belonging to a particular race, you are better than individuals of another race. Really a reductionistic viewpoint and belief about racial groups. So these are many different ways of thinking about race. At its core, it's a belief that certain groups are worth more or valued more or are inherently more capable, inherently more intelligent, or inherently better than other groups. But also what's emerging now in society is examining not only how this plays out on an individual level or on a cognitive level, beliefs that people have, but how it plays out in society, and how just because you as an individual may not experience discrimination because of your race, people who belong to your race as a whole, because of societal forces and other systemic forms of inequality, experience or may experience racism. And it's important to dissociate the concept of racism from the concept of xenophobia. Xenophobia, which can be defined as the dislike or prejudice against people from other countries, or the fear or hatred of things that are perceived to be foreign or strange or alien to you. Xenophobia is something that can be that we most often talk about in the form of an outgroup. It's something that is manifest in suspicion by one of the outgroup's activities, but a desire to eliminate an outgroup or prevent them from coming. Whereas racism is something that can be perpetuated even within an in-group, even within members of your country, members who share your citizenship, members who live in the same community as you do, who could otherwise be considered part of your in-group. Racism can be perpetuated against them, whereas xenophobia is primarily something we describe as members who are in an out-group. And so, as we previously mentioned, it's important to distinguish between the individual, the interpersonal, and the systemic aspects of prejudice and discrimination. And these apply also to the other forms of discrimination that we described in the previous video, that racism can show up individually or interpersonally. It can show up in the form of beliefs or actions that perpetuate oppression, such as internalizing beliefs about your own race. I am white, so therefore I am not going to be good at certain sports. That could be considered as a internalized form of racism because it is even if it's prejudice against yourself. Some authors would disagree and say that if you're a member of the dominant culture, then that which in the United States could be considered to be individuals who are white, then that wouldn't be classified as racism. But it all really depends on how you go about defining that form of racism based on the definitions that we provided previously. Racism may also show up in an interpersonal fashion. And this is probably what we most often think about when we think back to those many famous images of restaurants and government offices in the 1950s and 60s that said, Black people must drink from this water fountain, or whites only are being served at this edifice, or different ways in which people say or do things to another person in their presence to reinforce the belief that they are inferior because of their race. Those would be aspects of interpersonal racism, so things that are said or done amongst individuals. Then, more recently, there's been a rise in thinking about systemic aspects of racism. And when we say systemic, we're talking about not just individual actions or individual beliefs, but ways in which racism operates in society. It can operate in institutions, in specific organizations that serve to perpetuate oppression. So, for example, in many universities, there are policies or there are rules that systemically discriminate against people of color or people who are from lower socioeconomic status, or that make access to education harder for people who come from lower SES backgrounds. And so even though there might not be even though the person who is accepting individuals into a university may not be racist themselves or may not commit any interpersonal acts of racism, the systems or rules that are in place could still discriminate against individuals from particular racial groups or particular class groups. We also talk about structural racism, about how racism can impact multiple institutions or multiple organizations or multiple aspects of society and contribute to compounding effects against certain individuals. So, for example, if you look at the city of Detroit and the history of redlining, which is the practice of reserving certain areas of the city historically for urban renewal or for development or for the construction of highways, and reserving other parts of a city for wealthy housing, and which serve to really produce unequal outcomes in terms of both not only where people live, but also in terms of school funding. In the United States, we know that much of what contributes to school funding is property values of the homes in the communities of that school district. And so if you have rich people living in a particular school district, that school will be able to pay better teachers, will be able to pay for better services or for better extracurricular activities and have better outcomes for the students than a school that has that is in a community where there are lower property values. And so by restricting where certain people can live, particularly based on their race, or restricting who has access to certain home loans or who has access to certain services to improve their property values, that is a way of enforcing or perpetuating a form of systemic racism that affects not only where people live, but also future access to education and future funding and future wealth. And it compounds over time. So for example, in this image, you can see over here on the left, the Grosse Pointe region, which was highlighted in green as an area for wealthy housing developments, which if you visit there today, is still a very wealthy community. Whereas if you just cross over the border into Detroit, you'll notice that the look of the city and that the values of the homes changes drastically. What we know about that region is that the boundary between Detroit and Grosse Pointe public schools, but the boundary between their school districts is the most segregated school district boundary, or has the greatest difference in median property value between any school district boundaries in the United States. That the median property value and household income figures, the difference between them in those two school districts is the greatest anywhere in the United States. And so that's just one way in which that systemic racism is perpetuated here in our own city. More terms to be aware of in terms of how racism and bias are perpetuated. We often talk about implicit bias, and we contrast it with explicit bias, which implicit bias, which are unconscious attributions of particular qualities to a member of a certain social group. And this is contrasted with explicit bias. Explicit or conscious feelings or things that people say that are typically hostile or might favor their own group. Oftentimes, the way that racism works is not in terms of overt things that people say, but in terms of unconscious or implied, implicit things that people believe and that lead them to make certain actions. One way in which this is studied and measured is the implicit association test, which is a test that will be part of the quiz assignment for this week, in which individuals are asked to press quickly and associate a word with a particular stimulus. So for this example, associating positive words with a black face, or associating positive words or negative words with a white face. And what is described in the IAT effect is that in this example of the black-white race implicit association test, that it's much easier for people to associate good words or good qualities and characteristics with white faces than it is for them to associate those words with black faces. And this is commonly found across different racial groups, that the response time in milliseconds is longer for black faces than it is for white faces, which suggests that because people don't as readily associate those stimuli, that there's a bias against those against black people, essentially, and that it's not something that's necessary, or even among, and it's something that can be found even among people who profess that they aren't racist, even among people who are against certain forms of discrimination, or who openly express wanting to be anti-racist. These patterns can still be found. And so it suggests that much of the way in which racism operates is not solely in the conscious realm, but also in the unconscious, in ways that we have incorporated or learned values or beliefs from society that lead us to make certain assumptions. Now, there are some important criticisms of the study of implicit bias, and particularly the IAT. One is that this test has low test-retest reliability, that if you take it multiple times, you might get very, very different responses. And that probably has a lot to do with participant demand characteristics, that when individuals know how the results were the first time, that it consciously affects how they're going to answer the questions in following trials. Also, the IIT doesn't reliably predict discrimination in real life. In real life, many of the ways in which discrimination is perpetuated isn't solved in milliseconds. It's not done in just a blink of an eye. It's done over the course of days or even hours or even several minutes. And so just getting a score that shows that you have a slight preference for white people or Black people in terms of positive characteristics does not reliably predict that you will necessarily discriminate someone in real life. There's a disconnect there. Also, we know that this test is only a snapshot. It doesn't capture everything about implicit bias. It's only one representation of implicit bias. It's reduced to just milliseconds. So while many researchers have used this study and used this test to talk about some very interesting findings in social psychology and in the study of implicit attitudes, it doesn't show much promise in predicting real life behavior. And so there's much research on, or there's lots of traction gaining right now, particularly here in the state of Michigan, on implicit bias trainings, which are many of which take a form of trying to reduce the discrepancy in terms of these milliseconds on tests like the IAT, but those really have mixed results. However, there are some important strengths to also know about the IAT and the study of implicit attitudes and implicit biases. It is a really, really interesting way of quantifying internalized attitudes, which have historically been hard for psychologists to study. It's very, very hard for psychologists to know if someone is telling the truth. If you ask them a direct question of, are you racist or not? Are you okay with this form of discrimination or this prejudiced idea or not? People often want to present themselves in a way that is socially acceptable or in a way that looks good on them. And so the implicit association test allows us to bypass that completely and just look at their raw reaction time. Also, the study of implicit bias is important. It shows us that racism and other forms of discrimination, sexism, homophobia, are prevalent in society and people need to be educated out of them. Key to fighting implicit biases the key really is to disrupt the automatic thoughts that lead to discrimination, both recognizing the source of them, recognizing stereotypes and prejudices, and slowing down the process that leads to an unbalanced outcome. And so I've attached some videos, in particular a video by Dr. Jennifer Everhart, who is a leading social psychologist on this topic, who describes how intervening to slow people down from making quick biased decisions can help fight implicit bias. And lastly, this slide just describes some ways for everyone to get involved and fight prejudice and discrimination in all of its forms. And also some resources are listed on our Canvas page.